I'm 75 years old, and for most of my life, I was absolutely certain I understood religion. I prayed the right prayers. I stood when everyone stood. I bowed my head when I was told to bow it. And yet I've never talked about what that certainty cost me. Here's the confession I've never said out loud before. For decades, I used religion to feel safe not to become honest. I don't say that proudly. I say it because it's the truth that only comes when you are old enough to stop lying to yourself. At 75, you don't worry about sounding impressive anymore. You worry about sounding true. People assume that when you reach my age, faith becomes stronger, clearer, more peaceful. But what no one tells you is this: sometimes age doesn't strengthen belief. Sometimes it strips it bare. I've sat in quiet rooms at night, long after the prayers were said, asking myself questions I was afraid to ask at 30, at 40, even at 60. Questions like, did I believe because it was true, or because I was scared of what would happen if I didn't? I watched people I loved suffer. I watched good people feel unworthy, and I watched myself explain things away that didn't feel right in my chest. But the moment that changed everything didn't happen in the church. It happened alone, with no one listening but my own conscience. I'm not here to attack your faith, and I'm not here to tell you what to believe. I'm here because there's something I wish someone had told me before I gave away so many years without questioning my own heart. And I need to tell you this before it's too late for you too. To understand how I got here, you need to understand where I started. I was born into religion the way some people are born into a family business. It wasn't something you chose. It was something you inherited. In my case, it started before I could even read. By the time I was 5 years old, I already knew which words were allowed and which questions were not. Every Sunday morning followed the same script. Wake up early. Clean clothes laid out the night before. Shoes polished. Hair combed. By the time we sat down, the ritual had already done half the work it made belief feel automatic. At age 10, I could recite verses from memory. At 15, I knew how to sound faithful without feeling curious. By 25, I was doing what many adults do, repeating what I had been taught, mistaking familiarity for truth. From the outside, my life looked respectable. I married young 24. I worked consistently, 42 years in the same field. I missed fewer Sundays than I can count on both hands. People trusted me. They asked my opinion. They said things like, "You're a good, faithful man," and I believed them. Or at least I wanted to. Religion gave me structure when life felt chaotic. When my first child was born, I prayed not because I felt wonder, but because I felt responsibility. When money was tight in my 30s, I prayed for stability, not insight. When my father died, I prayed for comfort, not understanding. Looking back, I see something clearly now that I couldn't see then. I treated religion like insurance. Pay your dues, follow the rules, avoid disaster. And for a long time it worked. There's something comforting about having answers handed to you, about not having to wrestle with the unknown, about believing that if you live correctly, things will make sense in the end. But here's what no one tells you when you're young. Certainty can quietly turn into avoidance. I avoided conversations that made me uncomfortable. I avoided doubts by labeling them as weakness. And worst of all, I avoided listening to my own inner voice when it whispered, "Something here doesn't quite fit." I remember sitting in services, nodding along, while a part of me felt oddly distant, not rebellious, not angry, just disconnected. But instead of asking why, I told myself that doubt was dangerous, that curiosity was a slippery slope, so I stayed silent. Years passed like that, then decades. At 45, I was considered a man of solid faith. I volunteered. I donated. I gave advice to younger people about patience, obedience, and trust. I used phrases I had heard all my life. phrases that sounded wise but required very little personal examination. And yet, in private moments late at night, driving alone or staring at the ceiling, I felt a quiet tension I couldn't name. Here's the part that's hardest to admit. Religion didn't fail me overnight. It succeeded until it didn't. It carried me through routine, through habit, through social belonging. But it never taught me how to sit honestly with pain that didn't resolve, or questions that didn't end with a neat answer. The world changed. People changed. I changed. But my beliefs stayed frozen in time. I watched younger generations wrestle openly with ideas I was taught never to question. And instead of listening, I judged. I mistook their curiosity for arrogance, their doubts for moral failure. What I didn't realize was this: they weren't losing faith. They were searching for meaning. And then life did what life always does eventually. It disrupted the routine, not with drama at first, not with tragedy, but with a series of small moments that refused to be ignored. A conversation I couldn't dismiss, a loss that didn't resolve with prayer, a realization that made my rehearsed answers feel hollow. I didn't know it at the time, but I was approaching the moment that would force me to stop repeating beliefs and start examining them. And what happened next changed everything. The moment didn't arrive with thunder or divine revelation. It came quietly, the way most life-altering moments do. I was 68 years old. I remember that number clearly because at that age you start counting time differently. You stop thinking in decades and start thinking in how many good years are left. It began with a hospital room. A close friend of mine, someone I had known for over 40 years, was lying in a bed surrounded by machines that beeped without emotion. He was a good man by every standard we used to measure goodness. Loyal, generous, devout. He never missed a service, never caused trouble, never questioned anything out loud, and yet there he was in pain that no prayer seemed to touch. I stood beside his bed and said the words I had said 100 times before, words that usually brought comfort, words that usually closed the conversation. But this time they felt empty. He looked at me, his voice barely strong enough to carry, and asked, "Do you ever wonder if we got it wrong?" Those words landed heavier than anything I'd heard in a sermon. I didn't answer right away. I smiled politely. I said something safe, something rehearsed, something that avoided the question entirely. But the truth is that question followed me home. That night, I sat alone at my kitchen table long after the house was quiet. No music, no television, just me and the question I had spent my entire life avoiding. What if faith isn't about certainty at all? What if it never was? For the first time, I allowed myself to do something radical. I didn't rush to explain the discomfort away. I let it sit. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. I started rereading texts I thought I knew slowly, without the need to defend them. I noticed how often interpretation depended on who was speaking and who was listening. I noticed how frequently fear was used as a motivator, disguised as love. And then something unsettling happened. I felt lighter. Not because I had new answers, but because I had stopped pretending I already had them. There was grief in that realization. Deep grief. Because when you dismantle beliefs you've carried for decades, you don't just lose ideas, you lose identity. You lose community. You lose certainty. I grieved the man I had been, the man who never questioned, never paused, never risked being wrong. I remember standing in the shower one morning, water running, feeling tears mix with it, thinking, I've been faithful, but have I been honest? That was the turning point. Not a rejection of religion, but a rejection of unexamined belief. I realized that much of what I called faith was actually fear of exclusion, fear of disappointing others, fear of admitting I didn't know. And here's the hardest part to say out loud. Religion didn't shape my morals as much as my humanity did. My kindness didn't come from doctrine. It came from empathy. That realization didn't make me feel rebellious. It made me feel responsible. Responsible for the years I spent silencing questions in others. Responsible for the advice I gave that discouraged curiosity. Responsible for the version of myself that chose comfort over truth. But what happened next didn't push me into despair. It pushed me into reflection. Because once you accept that certainty may not be the goal, you start asking a much more important question. How do you live well when the answers are incomplete? Once I accepted that I might not have all the answers, something unexpected happened. I became more patient, not weaker, not lost, just more honest about what it means to be human. You see, for most of my life, I believe faith was about standing on solid ground, never wavering, never doubting, never admitting uncertainty. But at this stage of life, I've learned something very different. Faith, if it has any real value at all, isn't about certainty. It's about how you treat people when certainty disappears. When you're young, you want rules, clear ones. You want lines drawn sharply between right and wrong because chaos is frightening. I understand that now. I don't judge it. But wisdom doesn't come from memorizing answers. It comes from sitting with questions long enough that they soften you instead of hardening you. I think of life now like standing at the edge of the ocean. When you're young, you want to conquer it, measure it, explain it, master it. When you're old, you realize the ocean was never meant to be controlled. It was meant to be respected. Religion, at its best, should do the same thing. It should make you humble, not superior. Curious, not defensive. Compassionate, not certain that you're right and everyone else is wrong. One of the biggest lessons I learned too late is this. Belief systems are tools, and tools can build or harm depending on how tightly you cling to them. I've seen religion bring people together in moments of grief. I've also seen it push families apart over differences that never needed to be enemies. I've watched it inspire generosity and justify cruelty. The difference was never God. It was always the human heart using the idea of God. As I look back, I realize I wasted years trying to defend beliefs instead of practicing values. I argued doctrine instead of listening to pain. I quoted scripture instead of offering presence. And presence is what people remember. Not your certainty, not your theology. Your willingness to sit with them when answers fail. If you're watching this in your 20s or 30s, here's something I wish someone had told me. You don't have to abandon faith to grow, but you do have to outgrow fear. Fear of being wrong. Fear of asking why. Fear of admitting, I don't know. Those three fears will quietly steal decades from you. If you're older, maybe in your 40s, 50s, or beyond, listen closely to this part. It's not too late to re-examine what you believe. Re-examination is not betrayal. It's respect for truth. At 75, I no longer measure a belief by how confident it sounds, but by how much kindness it produces. I no longer ask, is this correct? First, I ask, does this make me more humane? That shift alone changed how I treat strangers, how I forgive family, and how I forgive myself. Because here's another truth no one tells you. Some of the guilt you carry was never meant to be yours. It was handed to you, taught to you, repeated until it felt like morality. Letting go of that guilt doesn't make you immoral. It makes you free enough to choose goodness deliberately. Not out of fear, but out of care. If I could reduce everything I've learned into one sentence, it would be this. A meaningful life isn't built on having the right answers. It's built on asking better questions and treating people gently while you search. And that understanding prepared me for the most important thing I need to say to you next, because reflection without action is just comfort in disguise. If there's one reason I'm speaking to you now, it's this. I don't want you to wake up at 75 and realize you lived someone else's version of a meaningful life. Time does not announce itself when it's being wasted. It passes quietly, disguised as routine, obligation, and this is just how things are. And belief, especially inherited belief, can become one of the most convincing disguises of all. So let me say this to you plainly. Without poetry or comfort, don't make my mistake. Don't outsource your conscience. Don't silence your questions to keep your seat at the table. And don't confuse obedience with wisdom. If a belief system requires you to ignore suffering, suppress curiosity, or judge others more harshly than you judge yourself, it's time to stop and ask why. Here is something actionable, something you can do starting today. Take one belief you've never questioned. Just one. Not the one that's easy. The one that makes you uncomfortable. Sit with it. Not to destroy it. Not to defend it. But to understand where it came from and whether it still serves the kind of person you want to become. That single act of honesty can save you decades. Because here's the quiet tragedy I see everywhere now. Good people wasting emotional energy defending ideas instead of living with integrity. You don't need to have everything figured out. You don't need perfect answers. But you do need to live awake. Awake to your own values. Awake to compassion. Awake to the reality that time is not promised and meaning is not automatic. At 75, I no longer worry about where I'll end up after this life. I worry about whether I was present enough in this one. If religion helps you love more deeply, forgive more freely, and live more honestly, hold on to it. Cherish it. But if it makes you fearful, rigid, or closed off from your own humanity, have the courage to examine it. No belief is more sacred than your capacity to care. I can't get my years back. I can't rewrite the conversations I avoided or the doubts I buried. But you still have time. Time to ask better questions. Time to live intentionally. Time to choose kindness over certainty. If this message stirred something in you, don't ignore it. Reflection is the beginning of responsibility. Take a moment, sit quietly. Ask yourself what you believe and why. And if you want more conversations like dishonest, uncomfortable, but deeply human, then subscribe. Stay. Reflect with me. Because the most important truths don't arrive fully formed. They arrive when we finally slow down enough to listen. And sometimes they arrive late.